Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of season 2 of Housed, the Shared Living podcast.
I'm Deanie Lee from the Property Marketing Strategists.
I'm Dan Smith from Student Housing Consultancy.
And I'm Sarah Canning from the Property Marketing Strategists.
Before we get into the show, it'd be great to hear from our wonderful sponsors, My Student Halls.
Housed, the Shared Living podcast, is sponsored by mystudenthalls.com, Student Accommodation Search. Let's find your place.
Once again, a big thank you to the My Student Halls team for sponsoring us. It's really great to have them along for this season, and we are really appreciative of their support.
And we're all together, which is really nice. And
Yeah, it's nice.
we usually do it virtually over video, so we are all in the same place, which is really nice.
Yeah, so when Dan talks too much, we can actually look at him properly in the eye and say, Dan, we need to stop
Or
now.
kick him.
Yeah, I got a lot of kicks under the table on the last episode, but we were talking about marketplaces, so,
Don't start again.
I'm done.
Anyway, on with this week's episode. So I think we're going to start with something that is being talked about a lot, although we don't know a lot about it. Still a lot of decision to be made from a government level, but I'm going to come to you, Sarah, because I know you recently went to the Unipol event on the renters reform.
Well, you're right. I think there's a lot that could happen, and I think the general consensus is that they think that most of it PBSA will be exempt from. That's not certain, but they think that that's the way it's going to go. The one thing, though, that does keep rearing its head that they think might not be exempt is about upfront payments, and that's still very much being talked about, that that's going to move to monthly payments, which is, I think, of slight concern probably for all of us, that I'm not sure that a lot of operators are geared up for monthly payments, certainly by direct debit, and that then puts a lot of onus on the student to be logging into their portal every month and making these monthly payments and being able to budget wisely for it. And that's a big resource from an accountancy point of view that could be quite challenging, not to mention that obviously international students will need a UK-based guarantor as well. So it's possibly very good news for guarantor businesses. I think generally, I think it's great for renters, and it's there to protect renters. And, it's all been done with the right intentions. I think probably what's been missed is that there are renters in this country as young as 18 years old. And there are certain things that I think put a lot of onus on young, vulnerable people to be making decisions, such as having to give notice if they're in an HMO. But them giving notice then puts the whole house under notice, which impacts their flatmate, and I think there's a lot of things that young people are going to have to get very, very wise to very, very quickly, which isn't a bad thing. It's giving them ownership, it's giving them authority, and it's giving them protection. But it's probably things that they're not aware of. They're probably not being advised by their parents because it's a very different process to probably what they were used to. And universities probably aren't there yet with giving advice. So I think it could be a little bit chaotic for a little while. And if it does come in, it's going to come in very, very quickly. And it's going to disrupt this coming letting season. So whilst there are no answers right now, we don't need to do anything. The advice from Unipol is, don't change anything, carry on business as usual, with the caveat that if things do change, you're going to have to change very, very quickly.
Who knows? The waters are very, very muddy. If you are a student HMO landlord, though, I would be a bit concerned. And I think that's because obviously the term sessions may get shorter and your amount of revenue coming in may get less as students give their notice and then move out before the end of a 51-week term session, and possibly well before that. So will we see a lot of student landlords potentially selling up or just jacking their prices up to make up for the shortfall? Maybe. In PBSA, hopefully we are exempt from a lot of the Renters Reform Act, but I am not 100% sure at the moment. It's clear as mud. That's the trouble. No one has a clue at the minute exactly what the extent of it is going to be for PBSA. Monthly payments, though, will be a nightmare. It'll be a nightmare to administer from a financial point of view. In my opinion, it will also increase the amount of absconders that you get and the amount of bad debt that you get at the end of the year. So there definitely needs to be some recalibration, as I keep saying, of underwriting if this does come in and is applicable to PBSA. Housing Hand and Leap, for example, will be rubbing their hands together if there's international guarantors that are mandated, because They're offering a great service, but it's going to add to lag times and booking times for anyone booking student accommodation. So it's going to be a real challenge across the board. PBSA won't be completely unaffected, I don't think, but just got to wait and see because no one has a bloody clue what's going on at the minute.
No, I think we'll come back to this, but just also to correct you, it's the Renters' Rights Bill. It's not called the Renters' Reform Bill anymore.
Right, yeah.
And I think the other big question mark is around ASTs, isn't it? Because essentially it sounds like ASTs will be illegal, but is PBSA exempt from that or not? And when we are literally weeks from the PBSA sector going live with new leases, where does that leave them? And I think the biggest issue is this is coming down the barrel very, very quickly, but we have none of the information to prepare for it. And that's the issue, ultimately.
Yep, we'll keep you abreast of it.
So, as we say, we will definitely come back to that because it's going to be a big, big thing coming to us all, but we'll keep you posted as and when we know more. So we wanted to talk a little bit about, been a couple of big reports released from the sector, from the Knight Frank and UCAS report came out, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and also the Class Foundation Student Living Monitor. Have you both had a read of it? What's the kind of key stats that you digest and what are we learning from it?
Big old reports. It's a shame they were released so closely together because I think I needed a little bit of brain space to be able to digest them both independently because actually they're coming at it from very different angles. So I do hope that the audience takes time to look at them both independently and digest them for their own merits because they are actually measuring completely different things, really. We split the content between the three of us, and I was looking more at the Class Student Living Monitor. And I think the key things that I took out, I think a lot of it is pretty obvious actually, but it's really good to see it in black and white. And obviously what the Class Monitor brings is the global outlook. We're not just looking at students from the UK. And the general feeling is that students that have choice, that have ownership, are happier where they're living. And I just feel like, bearing in mind the whole conversation that we had last week about marketplaces and incentives, I wonder if there is a correlation between when students book and how happy they are. I don't think that was covered in there, but if you're listening, Kellyanne and the team, I wonder if that's one for next year, because obviously when there's less availability, there's less choice. But if you're being absolutely hammered by incentives or agents, marketplaces being particularly aggressive, then does a student feel like they're having less choice in where they live? They're almost being railroaded into something, and therefore do they feel loyalty to that operator? Do they feel connected to the community? So I think that's quite an interesting dynamic. And the same with clearing as well. Those students, a large proportion are coming through clearing because they didn't get into the university that they first chose. So they're not in the university that they chose first choice. They're not in the city that they chose first, probably. And therefore, they're not going to be in the accommodation that they chose first. So that all correlates to them potentially not feeling happy and engaged, which is why I do think that kind of reliance on the clearing market is really dangerous, because the consequence of having those students in your building might not be, yes, you've got bums in beds, but actually they're not coming to you because they really, really wanted to. And that, I think, comes across in the class report as well.
Yeah, how happy are they going to be if they book late, pay more? I think that's really interesting about when, how happy students are as to when they book in the cycle. Is it that they're happier at the start when they feel like, okay, they can relax and they feel like they've got a good price because they've booked early? How's that going to make them feel when later on in the cycle there's loads of incentives that may kick in some markets, and they may not feel like they've got such good value for money as and when they see those discounts, etc. That's the problem with dynamic pricing, isn't it, ultimately, as well? I'd love to see the data on that and who could get that. StuRents would probably do a good job of it, Student Crowd maybe as well, but across the board it'd be really good to see that.
But also the comms can be really powerful in that scenario when someone is booking with you because they haven't chosen to. Actually, if you immediately make them feel welcome, you immediately show them what your product's about, and you immediately show that actually we're going to look after you, it reassures them, because don't forget they're going to be living with you for a good 10 months. So actually you've got a long time to bring them back round. So I think it's often, I think we've worked with universities whereby, because the allocations are done at the last minute, they allocate them a room. If the room is not available, they might automatically allocate them another one. But as long as you're saying that in a way as we're really, really sorry that we weren't able to offer you your first choice, but we've given you the best possible available room that matches, similar to your choice, and here's the benefits about it. That's very different to just saying, we couldn't get what you wanted, so we're giving you this. And I think that comms piece is just really important in that scenario when people aren't necessarily always able to get the product that they want in the right place.
We see it a lot with universities properties that people obviously, they get, it's quite often they have to choose 6 because that's how many spaces there are. And, and actually they only really wanted number 1 and 2 accommodation, but they're forced to fill in a form that says 3, 4, 5 and 6. And, and they're obviously then definitely being kind of railroaded into a route that they're not really comfortable with, that they didn't choose. So, yeah, I think, choice, authority is really, really important. The other thing that I picked up about it was the services that they really rated that make them feel happier and better mental health is things that connect them. So they rated career support really highly, and they rated community networking apps really, really highly as well.
Interesting.
And also kind of, I guess, combined with that, those who take part in activities and events rank higher in the happiness score. I said that's obvious, but if you combine that with them rating community networking apps highly, then actually it's a two-pronged approach, isn't it? That they're kind of, I guess, networking on a local level, maybe with students in their flat and on their floor and in their building, and then you combine that with actually attending events. So I think it's a really interesting read, and it's probably things that you need to layer on top of each other to kind of create that, I guess, perfect living environment that creates happy residents.
And I think what's really good about that class report is that it is a European-wide report, so you get a kind of idea of what's occurring not just in the UK and across, and I think that's a really good insight to have, so it's definitely worth reaching out to look.
Although I think the swimming pool and catering aspect was very much non-UK swayed, but interesting nonetheless.
Yes. So on to the kind of Knight Frank UCAS report. I think one of the most striking things that I noticed in that, we talk a lot about affordability and the lack of product types for different customers across the market. And I think the question that is obviously asked every single year around, did you see your accommodation as value for money? The striking thing that we noticed that in 2023, 52% of students thought that their PBSA accommodation was good value for money. That has now dropped to 44%, and I think that is quite a stark reality of where we are in pricing. What's actually going to happen next year as well is my big question mark around that, and it just goes to show how sensitive people are to price and that correlation between you feeling that you've got good value for money and a good product at the end of it.
That is a big drop in 1 year, isn't it? 8% drop in 1 year in terms of the happiness of students and whether they see they're getting value for money. And I think you've both done a lot of research and work and reports on that value gap and where students are actually really struggling. And we've built a lot of mid-range stock that I think we're charging a lot of money for now, and students aren't necessarily seeing that there is value for money. I think it was your report that said students in the premium sector are happiest, their expectations are high, and they're met by the premium providers. And then they're also in the lowest in the affordable sector as well, because their expectations are a little bit lower.
We can't take credit for that, Dan. That was Student Crowd, but thank you.
Well done, Student Crowd, for providing that, because it's really important that we actually see where are we missing value, where are we not delivering for those students. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of operators that I would say are mid-range and operating in that area that are delivering really good value. But I think as the pricing creeps up and your stock doesn't improve, I think that's where you're really going to struggle.
I was just going to say that, actually. Like, prices go up every year, but the properties deteriorate. So this feels, it's no wonder that expectations aren't being met and people don't feel like they're creating value. And I think there's an additional pressure on the sector to have 51-week contracts, which means maintaining buildings becomes really, really tough. And those kind of refurbishments, people can't afford to decant students anymore. I haven't seen that for years, really.
No.
And that kind of rolling refurb style of kind of repurposing buildings. So yeah, that's a whole other debate, really. Why are prices going up when the buildings are getting tireder?
Well, I've seen Unite Unite have just done 3 big projects, CapEx projects, over the course of the summer to improve amenities and social spaces and whatever. So there's a lot of operators that will look at it. I think there's a bit of an issue with regards to spending money on CapEx at the moment. And, it's been seen in the last few years, well, hey, look, we've got no availability problems, so we don't need to really invest in it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And now this year, when it's been a bit tougher, international students have dropped, and we've seen that there are some affordability challenges. And again, we don't have a student housing crisis, we have an affordability crisis in student housing. That's what it is. So I think that there's a bit of a reticence to invest in the CapEx, but that may well catch up.
I just wanted to add to that, because I think we spoke about this at the Urban Living Festival, Sarah, and we were there, and we went to a presentation on single family houses, and they were saying that renters really love the kind of single family rented house because they come in, it's all ready, it's all new, it's ready to go. They don't have to fix anything. But that's in like year 1 or year 2 of a new model. What's that going to be like in 20 years' time? And actually, what is that rolling refurbishment programme, both for BTR, for single family housing? Because yes, we all love to being a nice new place that everything works, but everything needs maintenance. You know that as a homeowner, like you never get a day off from kind of having to maintain your home. But what do you do when they're rented out for 52 weeks a year?
So are we saying that there should be, you can't just look at increasing pricing year on year without taking into account buildings deterioration, and there probably needs to be somewhere where it meets in the middle? There's a convergence at some point where those metrics don't work anymore. I'm not saying that necessarily the prices would come down, because inflation probably overtakes it eventually, but surely you can't put prices up 5%, 10% when the buildings are deteriorating. It then needs to come down to, a modest 2-3% increase when your buildings are becoming more tired.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that if you're looking at double-digit rent increases, you need to be adding value to that asset in some way, shape or form to then show that customer who might be rebooking and thinking, hang on a minute, why is my price shot up by 10, 20%, 23% in Glasgow, for example? And it's still the same people there. It's still the same amenities. My room is still exactly the same. And yet I'm paying 23% more. And sometimes, I've seen 50% increases for some room categories, sometimes even further. But 50% was one I can actually document and have seen firsthand. That is astronomical for a year-on-year increase with no improvement in service or amenities. So that's something that we definitely need to be mindful of. Now, PBSA in this Knight Frank report comes out very, very well. 67% of first-year students living in private PBSA would recommend their accommodation to other students, versus just 41% of first years living in private rented sector house shares. So not great for HMO market, great for PBSA. Certainly something to watch as the HMO market changes and adjusts to the Renters' Rights Act, which, they've just changed the title, to be fair. Let's be completely honest. Yeah, not great for the HMO sector there, but very good for PBSA. We're obviously doing something right in PBSA there, but we still have to show that added value and affordability. And I should just say that report from Knight Frank was excellent. It wasn't a sales brochure. It was genuinely objective. Of course, there was a few things saying, the fundamentals look really good for PBSA. Well, I think you need to break that down now and look at individual locations. It looks really good in certain locations within London or Bath or Durham or, I think that's where we're at now. We need to look much more regionally at some of these things. But yeah, it was an excellent report, really impressed. And if you haven't read it, get onto the Knight Frank website, or you'll probably see Katie O'Neill talking at various different events. She was very good at operational resi living, and it just comes across very well, and it doesn't come across like it's a sales pitch for PBSA. It's very, very good. So yeah, have a read.
I just wanted to come back to the point that you were talking about who would recommend their accommodation to. And one thing I did think that was striking that's worth pointing out is that those that recommended BTR or PRS was much higher if they're in the second year. And I think this just goes to show around product diversity that actually first-year students are going to be less likely to recommend BTR or PRS because you need to be much more mature. You need to have a much more independence and understanding of how you live in those environments. Whereas if you're second or third year, a bit older in the tooth, and you've been around the kind of the city a few times and you know what you're doing, you're more likely to recommend it. So I think it's just still supporting that argument that you can't say a first-year student is the same as a second-year student or a third-year student. They're all very different.
And that's why I think we're seeing diversification within brands as well. And various different operators are launching post-grad brands or second and third-year returner operating brands. And that's why BTR is stealing a march on PBSA, because ultimately it's delivering what students want, and in particular international students, and in particular Chinese students. So we do need to be mindful of the fact that there's a reason that students are choosing BTR, and BTR isn't necessarily shouting about that. I think we're doing a lot of the shouting in PBSA on their behalf, but I think it's really important just to notice that it's not the rite of passage that it used to be. First year halls, second year HMO, third year maybe HMO or PBSA. But there are so many nuances to each individual location now, with BTR popping up left, right, and centre, and new PBSA brands, more post grad thought, and they all want different things. We have to break down those students into undergrads, internationals, domestics, postgrads, whatever it might be?
I'm not sure that I am seeing different in product for postgrads. The brand, as in the logo, might be different, but I'm not convinced the product is, other than saying that postgrads want to live in studios. You know, are the services different? Are the comms different? Is the tone of voice different? Are the events and activities different? Etc. etc. So yeah, I reserve the right to come back to that one when I've seen something that I truly believe is a differentiator in product.
I agree. It is new. So I think the jury's out on that. How different is a postgrad product going to be compared to an undergrad product? But yeah, I think there's going to be more of a focus on services. Less so, it's not going to necessarily be amenities. But again, we can't just keep building studios and think postgrads want studios or international postgrads want studios. We have to be really mindful of the fact that BTR is being chosen for a reason. And I think that there's got to be more introspection from the PBSA industry, developers in particular, to say, right, what do we actually need to build here? And not just what's viable to make the money work.
Yeah, what's the gap?
Yeah, totally.
And I mean, our research has consistently said over the last 2 or 3 years that people are looking to live with 4 or 5 people. But can you find many PBSA for 4 or 5 people? No. So why wouldn't you go and live in BTR where you can live with that many people? And I think, the data's all there, as we've said before. Please read it, please look at it, and please don't build the same thing. We will move on to a question, I guess. Is everyone going into third-party management?
Just for transparency, Student Housing Consultancy does tender processes for third-party management on behalf of developers and investors. Done quite a few of these this year. It's something we're going to be doing a lot more of. It's fascinating to see who's out there, what they want, and what's going to be the right fit for the investor. We typically don't have to recommend. We typically put it on a plate for an investor or a developer to take their pick. But we make it really, really simple for them to compare and contrast some of these OPEXs, the revenue budgets. We look at the credit reports, the ESG, the reputation management. We speak to the universities and partners and really paint a picture of what that operator is doing. Now, it's really easy for any operator with about, 2,000 beds or so to say, I'll tell you what, we'll just manage that property down the road and we'll do it for a flat rate management fee. I am starting to see there are more and more operators starting to move into that third-party sector because I think they've seen what's happened at Homes for Students and they've seen how strong they've become, how quickly they've done it, how well they've done it, and they want a piece of the action, if I'm being completely honest. And I think that it isn't just a case of, we beds are beds, we'll just step in and run that. It takes a lot more, and I think that that's where kudos to Martin Corbett and Scott and Graham and Kate and the team, because they've built something that is very impressive, has huge scale, and those economies of scale in some places are quite difficult to beat in terms of the OPEX and understanding of the markets and revenue budget. But at some point, there's definitely a saturation point within certain cities. Prime example being somewhere like Sheffield, where Homes for Students, for example, have sort of 14 properties in Sheffield. But it's difficult to see how a smaller investor would then take priority over some of these bigger investors. When for that developer with, 300 beds or 150 beds or whatever, this is their baby, that's their everything. And they're up against some really big investors with huge portfolios across the UK with Homes for Students or other investors as well, whether it be CRM or Fresh or whatever it might be. How do you maintain your position as the priority for each operator? That's a really difficult thing. But what I'm seeing at the moment in the market is that everybody's trying to turn their hands to it. And if they'd left the market, third-party market, they're trying to get back into it because there's a bit of a scale at all costs mentality at the moment. And I've counted and been through 30 different operators across the UK, PBSA operators, that are saying that they would like to be involved in some of these tenders. And sometimes I'll reach out to them and sometimes I won't for some of these. And it's the same with anyone working on any of our tenders. It is a really challenging thing to run a property that is not your own and run it to the best of your ability, especially when the management fees are so low. So yeah, it's a really interesting place at the moment, the third-party market space.
I always think it's really, really challenging because, especially for new operators coming into this market, is that really to make it work the best for both the investor and the operators, you've really got to collaborate and work together. And at some cases, you're really going to have to challenge the investor and the investor's assumptions. But as a new client, as a small business, that's really difficult to do when you've probably said best case scenario, this is what I'm going to achieve, but actually the market's not performed how you want. And then you've got to go back to the investor and say, well, actually, you've got to go and do something else now. And it's really challenging being a third-party operator.
It is incredibly hard. And kudos to anyone who's going in to do it. And I did it at Nido, launched the third party at Nido with Nido Globeworks, which I'll probably pop to a bit later on. It just wasn't as easy as I was expecting it to be. And we got lucky, we got a good contract, and I felt like we were earning good money, we were incentivized, and I handed that over and then moved on to pastures new. And I know that was a really challenging asset to mobilize and get full. But I think that the challenge that we have is that we have so many people looking to get into the third-party marketplace, and we have only a few that I would class as experts now. And there's been a bit of movement, and there will be more movement for some of these third-party operators, because there's going to be some in-housing from some very big investors that's going to move some beds away from some third-party operators and cause a bit of a domino effect. And so I think there'll be some ripples over the course of the next year. So that will be interesting to watch and see where that lands. What I'm keen to do in all of the tender processes that I run and that we run as a business is make sure that it's really objective, but that we're not just, comparing OPEX line for line. We do get that in order and make sure that it's really clear as to what operators are spending on security or staff or, the maintenance or the reactive maintenance and the contracts and broadband and whatever else it might be. And, I think the focus does also have to be, how's that city looking? What's the relationship like with the operators and marketplaces and universities, and how are they positioned to really fill that building? When, for example, in Birmingham, there might be parts of Birmingham that are oversupplied or more mature, and I can see that there's loads of cashbacks on for certain operators. Well, how's that going to land for this smaller investor later on in the market? That's going to be a real challenge because it's third party. But I just don't want to see that race to the bottom.
I was going to ask, do you think that more competition from third-party operators will drive standards up or operations costs down?
No, I think there's always a tendency when you're trying to scale at all costs, and that is what's happened in the industry. I mean, it always has, from the days of CRM and Collegiate fighting against each other almost, and Fresh obviously being in there as well, to then Homes for Students becoming ultimately the number one third-party student accommodation operator in the country for third party. I think there's always been a bit of a tendency to focus on, showcase as much revenue and as low an OPEX cost as you can. Now, when I first started doing those third-party tender processes, that's what I was really expecting to find, to see that, these guys were just wanting to get the beds on board. They didn't really care if the investor actually, made his money 2-3 years down the line. They just wanted to win the business, sign the contract for 2-3 years, and they could do that by showing a high revenue, a low OPEX, a really good NOI, and a really low base management fee, because it was, can we get to X number of beds or whatever it might be. I haven't actually seen that. I think there's been a smaller split between all of the operators that I've seen for the tender processes that we've done, between the NOI, the revenue, the OPEX costs. There's some disparity between who wants 24-hour security and how much they're paying the staff in particular. That's where I see there's, and also how much people are spending on reactive maintenance and proactive maintenance. So that's where we can help the investor to say, well, what's your focus? What are you looking for at the moment? Do you want a high valuation because you're looking to refi, or you're looking to forward fund, or whatever it might be? In which case we can help you paint that picture, but we have to be very objective. I'm always incredibly careful that our reputation's on the line, but that we also need to make sure that we're delivering for the investor and for the client. So knowing what that's going to look like in 2 to 3 years' time, and that you can't jack up your rents 7% every single year, I have to go through and say to this investor, look, that's not going to happen. I don't think that operator is being realistic about that. We need to make sure that you're pushing back and that you're, incentivizing them to deliver that. So it's a really interesting space. I haven't seen I've seen a little bit of a difference between certain areas of it, but there's not this massive disparity where there's one operator trying to win business at all costs. I do think some of the management fees are still a bit too low, and I think that does need to change. But and obviously that's not music to any investors' ears, but I do think that will help the third-party sector really start to be incentivized and deliver best practice. Whereas you've got the owner-operators, it's slightly different for them, and I do feel that there's more ownership there, and they're really looking to turn the screw because they're so much closer to the capital.
Well, we will watch this space and we'll see whether someone else comes in and becomes as big as Homes for Students. Yeah, we'll see what happens. That is a wrap, I think, for this week. A big thank you to Friends of Earth Birmingham for letting us use their lovely podcast studios, and I'm sure making us sound fantastic. So thanks all for listening. Once again, a big thank you to our sponsor, My Student Halls. We really do appreciate the support with our sponsors to ensure that we can keep this podcast going. We'll be back next week for some more news and insights, so please subscribe and share.